On this video, I want to do a little overview of the main biomes of the oceans, and in no way I'm going to be doing any justice to these ecosystems because you're going to need a whole marine biology class to really understand and appreciate the beauty of them. And remember that they cover 70% of their surface, and over 70% actually, so there's a lot there is to learn. In fact, this is what the Earth mostly is all about, the oceans. Here you see the intertidal zone. The intertidal zone is the area that is sometimes above water, sometimes below water, and you see that there's a lot of crawlers that typically live here, a lot of mussels and crabs and things like sea stars. They're like benthic kind of life forms that live in the bottom of the ocean. But they do have to be adapted to be sometimes above, sometimes below water, because that's kind of the situation that's going to be happening here. During the high tide, this area usually gets flooded, but during the low tide, it gets exposed to everything. So it does support a lot of the ecosystems that live near the beach, a lot of birds and a lot of things like that. It's a very important ecosystem, and human activity is definitely changing this a lot because we're polluting the environments near the coast a lot, and this is going to affect the intertidal zone significantly, not to mention that we also use our beaches in most cases. You also have the coastal oceans. The coastal oceans represent one of the most diverse ecosystems that we have in the oceans because they have the most nutrients and therefore the most productivity of all the areas in the ocean. There's a constant runoff coming from the continents. Places like rivers are constantly throwing sediments, salts, and nutrients from the continents into the oceans. In fact, we throw a little bit too much because our sewage and our runoff from our plantations and lawns and things like that actually cause a lot of algae to be growing here near the beach. But even in natural ecosystems not affected by humans, the coastal oceans are the ones that have the most nutrients for two reasons: that runoff off the rivers, and also coming from the bottom of the oceans, that upwelling current that we talked about. Remember, if the oceans are kind of like this, the upwelling will constantly drag nutrients towards the shallow water. And remember, the nutrients tend to concentrate at the bottom where all the decomposers are basically working on all of that stuff. So that makes the coastal oceans the most nutrient-rich area of the oceans, which makes it support the most kinds of life. So the majority of life in the oceans actually large life forms, a lot of them actually come to the coastal areas to eat and sustain themselves when they actually want to hunt and things like that. Then you also have a special type of coastal ocean ecosystem that's called the coral reef. And it's based on this calcareous exoskeleton-like animal that actually builds a rocky-like surface. In fact, when they die, they literally calcify and become rock. Florida, for example, is made of a coral, or ancient coral reef. So coral reefs are basically based on this animal, the coral, and the coral lives in symbiotic relationships with algae. A lot of coral lives in symbiotic relationship with algae. That means that the algae will feed the coral, and the coral will add protection to the algae and also serve to give nutrients, filter out the nutrients from the water that the algae needs in order to survive. But this means the coral needs sunlight. Now, not the coral itself, but the algae that lives inside of it. So if you actually have the water covered with algae in the surface, that means there's too many algae growing in the surface, the coral that's living attached to the bottom will not survive. So that means that, first of all, you got to be in shallow water because the algae needs the light, so it can't be too deep. But it also can't be covered with algae in the surface. So the coral is a perfect example of an ecosystem that only exists in specific conditions. It's like a niche for that ecosystem. It's perfect for that condition. It's got to be a coastal ocean where the temperature is actually warm, but not too warm or too cold, and there's not too many nutrients, so the algae doesn't go crazy in the surface. And that narrows down the place where the coral can live. And you see in the top left side the areas of the world which are coastal but have too much upwelling, too much runoff from the continents in order for the coral to grow, because there's too many nutrients growing, too many algae in the surface of the water blocking the sunlight. So where the water is shallow, it's going to be too murky for the coral to actually grow. The algae that lives inside the coral will not get enough sunlight to support it, and then it will not work. This leaves only certain areas, like the oceanic area over here near Australia, the Caribbean, and the Mediterranean Sea. Very few areas of the world which coral is still around. And in fact, it's actually going extinct because we are adding so much nutrients to the water because of human activity, and the world is warming up. So the coral is so sensitive to those things, and that means it's going away. And it's a good indicator of what's happening with global warming, because as the temperatures warm up and those oceans become warmer, the coral is forced to either migrate somewhere else or die. But since coral is stuck to the floor, it doesn't have much of a choice. So it's got to only hope that its reproductive processes will succeed and the water will, and they will spread before they go away. But coral is very peculiar to where it grows, and so it's going to be very difficult for coral to survive the global warming periods that they're going on right now. But either way, that's the coral reefs, and it's one of the most beautiful and diverse ecosystems of the water. That's why I took so much time to talk about it. And it's actually luscious and diverse like the rainforest is on the land. And if you like this kind of stuff, I suggest to take a marine biology class so you can learn more about coral reefs and their ecosystems. You also have the open oceans, and the open oceans are the most vast ecosystems of the earth. And although the concentration of nutrients in the open oceans is a lot lower than the coastal oceans, you still have a lot of productivity, not because there's a lot of concentration of algae, but because this is such a huge area that takes almost all of the surface of the earth, that by definition you're going to have a lot of productivity going on if you take a look at the ecosystem as a whole. So the open oceans is actually where the oxygen of our planet comes from, and for the most part, because algae living near the surface of that water is going to be constantly doing the productivity. But remember, you're going to find more algae more likely in the coastal oceans where there's more nutrients. But a lot of life forms live in the open oceans, things like whales, so for example, large fish, schools of fish. They will live there, but remember there's less food, so a lot of these animals will be the kinds of animals that go to the land when they need to eat, to hunt from the areas of the coastal oceans where are very productive. And as you go deeper and deeper into the open water, there's less and less life that's living out there. Very peculiar types of life that can survive a long time without eating. For example, whales do even something interesting. Some kinds of whales actually go to the North Pole during the summer where there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the water, and so the algae grows like crazy. And they will eat from the animals that are eating up the algae, and they will gorge themselves for 3 months and get fat, full of stored food, and then they will spend 3 months doing the travel back all the way to the South Pole, where they'll spend another 3 months eating from there, because now it's summer down in the South Pole, so the situation is opposite. It's dark in the North Pole, the algae numbers go down, but the South Pole is productive now, so now they're in the South Pole eating the animals which are eating the algae, and so it keeps going back and forth. The polar regions are the most productive coastal areas of the world, because it's also, in addition to all the nutrients that you can have in the shallow waters near the continents in upwelling, you also have a lot of carbon dioxide because the water is cold, and cold water tends to trap more gases. So the polar regions are the green pastures of the world. But remember, it's 6 months of darkness, 6 months of sunlight, so if you want to live like that, you got to go back and forth. So crazy stuff that some whales do. Not all whales live like that, but some ones actually do. Here you see another kind of ecosystem, that's the benthic system. Now this will exist all throughout the ocean, since the intertidal zone all the way to the bottom of the ocean. And this is basically the bottom, where very few life forms will actually live, and the majority of the life forms that will live there will be bottom dwellers. Things that live attached to the bottom of the ocean and kind of like eat off like detrivores and decomposes. Everything that dies in the oceans ends up falling to the bottom. So especially near the coastal line, when there's a lot of life, all that there's going to be teeming with detrivores living in the bottom of the ocean as well. But even in the open oceans, you find a lot of life. And there's even some productivity at the bottom of the ocean, because near volcanic vents, you have those chemotrophs, those super awesome primitive kinds of life that mimic the kinds of life that live in the early Earth. And they will be the ones which are going to be producing their energy off chemical compounds, so they don't even need the sunlight. And there's a whole food web down there that's based on eating those chemotrophs or eating the decomposers, and they eat each other up, and there's a whole food web going on like that. And there's even some large animals. And to be honest, we don't know much about the deepest of the parts of the oceans and limits of what can be there. We are still finding out, we're still researching a lot about what's down there. That's it. There's a lot to learn about the oceans. 71% of the world is the most unknown area of our planet, and we're constantly learning more and finding out new species that live in this vast ecosystem.